She's a former model who spent more than a year in prison.
An 18-year-old in Daytona Beach beaten by the father of a child he sexually assaulted.
From the streets of India to the courtrooms of America, these murderers learned the hard way not to mess with the wrong people.
I attacked him viciously, and I didn't stop.
Number 1. The mother who took down her daughter's killer. Marianne Bachmeier, a mother who had herself been the victim of SA when she was pregnant, couldn't bear to deal with the pain of her 7-year-old little girl, Anna, going through the same. During the trial, after looking at Anna's pictures, Bachmeier knew she wasn't going to hold back. And she walked into room 157 of the Lübeck District Court with a Beretta 70 she had smuggled in. Her target was a 35-year-old butcher, Klaus Grabowski, who had taken responsibility for the sexual assault and murder of Anna. He had taken the life of the little girl who visited his home, often to play with the cats by strangling her with his fiancée's tights. Bachmeier took justice into her own hands on the third day of the trial on March 6, 1981. Calmly walking into the courtroom, she approached the man from behind, pulled the gun out of her wide coat pocket, and fired at him. Exactly 7 times, each for a year of life he had snatched from her daughter's life. The officers stood back until she was done, and after that, she didn't resist. The only thing she hoped for was that Grabowski had died, as she had originally aimed for his face and failed. The murderer died on the spot. Her statement: she did it for her daughter. Bachmeier was convicted of manslaughter and received a 6-year sentence, but was released on parole after serving just over 3 years. Why? Because the court declared it wasn't revenge. She did it to prevent Grabowski from tarnishing Anna's memory and bad-mouthing her in his testimony. She died at 46 and was buried next to her daughter, Anna, in Bergtor Cemetery, Lübeck. Number 2. The one who hired the wrong guy to do the deed for her. Up next is this lady who slipped into the car, greeting and chatting like she was catching up with an old buddy. But don't let her casual act fool you. You see, the woman in question is Julia Charlene Murfeld, a 21-year-old who's had it up to here with her marriage to the father of her 2 kids. Time for divorce? Nah, that wasn't her style. Especially not when her husband had a hefty life insurance policy worth $400,000. The man she was talking to in the car wasn't the hitman. It's actually an undercover cop who had been tipped by Carlos Ramos, Julia's co-worker who had a dark past, which made him the perfect accomplice in Julia's mind. He shook it off as a joke when Julia told him her plan, but when she offered him $50,000, he knew it was time to call the Michigan State Police detective. Julia didn't mince words. She straight up told the undercover cop that offing her husband would be way easier. She even had it all planned out. She'd be away for work, the hitman would do the deed, and they'd stage it to look like a burglary gone wrong. She even had the decency to ask for a painless exit for her husband. But thankfully, her husband dodged that bullet. Julia was busted after her second meeting with the undercover detective on April 10, 2013. In the trial, Julia showed some remorse, owned up to her wrongdoing, and took full responsibility. And guess who fell for the crocodile tears? Not the judge. She got slapped with a sentence of at least 5 years and 8 months behind bars, with the possibility of up to 20 years. The one who actually forgave her was the husband, who didn't want his kids to grow up without a mom, but one who tried off their dad. That's totally fine. Number 3. Suspect tried to kidnap a cop. The stupidity of murderers isn't limited to just hiring hitmen. We all know that. But this one had the audacity to go attack an armed cop and even try to kidnap him. 38-year-old Brandon Lemaine was driving a U-Haul truck that was flagged as stolen. An officer found the vehicle and followed it to a gas station where he approached the suspect. When the suspect was informed that he was to be detained, the man didn't think straight. And when the cop was trying to get the handcuff and radioing in the situation, Brandon grabbed the holster, pulled the officer, and slammed him against the car. He could have run away at this point, but no. He goes ahead, opens the police car's door, and forces the officer inside with him. This idiot then tries to get the officer's gun, proceeds to put the car in reverse, and drives into a McDonald's lot, where he hits two vehicles. That's when Christopher Grube, an officer, catches up to him. Soon enough, Kenyatta Momom, a 24-year veteran master police officer, was ready to save his fellow cop from this to-be murderer. He pulls the suspect from the vehicle and fires several shots at close range. The attacker lost his life on the spot, and the officer's actions were declared life-saving. As they should be. Number 4. Model tries to get her husband's ex thrown in a lumberjack.
She's a former model who spent more than a year in prison for plotting a murder before the verdict was overturned.
And up next is yet another murderer who tried to outsource the dirty deed and ended up hiring the wrong person. 32-year-old Tara Lambert is also caught on camera when she steps into a parked car to meet with someone she believes is a hitman. Who was her target? Kelly Cook, the ex-girlfriend of her husband. Since the husband had 2 kids with Kelly, some visitation issues just didn't sit right with Tara, and after dealing with those so-called problems for 7 years, she just had enough. She ranted to a friend and asked her to find some guy to kill the ex. The friend was not so blindly loyal, so she set up a sting operation. Here, Tara made her motive clear. She wanted the woman gone. She even had a plan for how the scenario could play out. The classic robbery gone wrong. And if the new husband, Sean Cook, happens to be in the way, the hitman has a free rein to take him out as well. Unfortunately for her, just a little while after this, she found herself in the investigation room, where she continued to deny any wrongdoing, even insisting that she was best friends with her victim. The jury came to a conclusion in 42 minutes during the trial. She was guilty of conspiracy of murder. A year later, she got a break when her conviction was overturned due to a technicality. The prosecution had messed up and couldn't prove a key part of the conspiracy charge against her. So, instead of facing another trial, Lambert decided to plead guilty. In return, she got a lighter sentence of 5 years, with credit for the year she'd already served. This woman clearly had no remorse for her actions when she was ordering a hit after hit as if she was in a restaurant. In my personal opinion, she deserved a stricter sentence. Number 5. Mom takes down a robber. An armed thief thought he could prey on a group of kids outside a school in Brazil, but he didn't count on a brave mother being there too. When the guy points his gun in a heartbeat, the mother draws her own weapon and confronts the thief. And it looks like she's no stranger to using guns because it takes her seconds to fire multiple times and send the thief tumbling to the ground, his weapon clattering away. While everyone else scrambles away in fear, this mom stands tall, keeping her gun aimed at the thief. She tells him to lie down, and he listens, probably realizing he messed with the wrong crowd. Still in action mode, she swipes the robber's weapon away from him and then puts her foot on his back. She's not letting him wiggle out of this until help arrives. Turns out our hero in this story wasn't just any mom. She was actually an off-duty officer named Katia da Silva Sastre, age 42. Now about the guy with the gun? Well, turns out he didn't make it. He was rushed to the hospital, but not so sadly passed away later on. Number 6. Dad saves his son saves his dad. You know how
We showed you the amazing picture last week, a suspected child molester after a run-in with the dad.
An 18-year-old in Daytona Beach, beaten by the father of a child he sexually assaulted, is going to prison for 25 years.
Most of the time, it's someone close to the family who ends up abusing someone. Well, that was the case with 18-year-old Raymond Frolander. He was practically considered family by Brownings, but he had been molesting their 11-year-old son for quite some time. In 2014, 35-year-old Jason, the dad, steps out for a quick bite to eat. But when he gets back home, he hears his son crying from the bedroom. He knew that something was up, so he goes to check it out. And what does he find? His son in distress, with Frolander right there in the room, hurting him. Jason's anger boils over and he starts hitting Frolander, giving him a serious beating.
I attacked him viciously, and I didn't stop because I was going to kill him.
The whole thing only stopped when Jason had to dash to the kitchen and grab a butcher knife. Because he was so overwhelmed, he said he was going to end it all. Sadly, it was actually Jason's son, the victim, who intervened and saved his abuser.
Because I was going to kill him. And my son stepped in front of me and saved his life. He just looked at me and said, "Sir," and he shook his head and said, "No."
Just a shake of his head was all it took for Jason to snap out of it. Seeing his son's reaction, Jason knew he had to put a stop to the violence. He didn't want his boy to be even more traumatized than he already was. After that, the dad dialed 911 and told them he'd rescued his son and they could take the criminal away who was suffering the consequences of his action. Frolander's face was as hideous as his actions after the beating. Regardless, he was taken to the hospital and then to jail. The father obviously didn't face charges for the beating because he was just protecting his child as a crime was being committed. Following advice from his lawyer, Frolander pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in prison to avoid a mandatory life sentence. At the sentencing, the father said briefly that Frolander would learn in the next 25 years why he let him live. Given the low regard for child predators in prison, let's hope Frolander's time there is nothing short of hell. Number 7. The sister who avenged her brother. Now on the list, I've got this big sister who didn't wait around to act because the last time she trusted the law, the case stayed unsolved. When 21-year-old Titiana Coppage learned that her 16-year-old brother, Jason Ugwu, was shot and killed in Kansas City, Missouri, she didn't sit around to wait. While the police were still investigating the case, she had tracked the suspected murderer down and shot him fatally in a parking lot just 3 days after she lost her brother. And even though it was taking forever for the authorities to track down the suspect, they didn't have to do much investigation to link Coppage to the shooting. Apparently, it was all caught on CCTV when she went from her home to the said location where 36-year-old Keith Lars was found dead. When authorities went through her text messages, they found 2 more pieces of evidence. In one message to her deceased brother, she mentioned sending someone to him because she owed him that body. And her rage wasn't just to get justice for her brother. The sister had gone through the pain of losing 2 other family members as well. They were just kids, both boys, Jaden Ugwu, 9, and Montel Ross, 8, who were killed while they slept as bullets tore through their bedroom walls. Unfortunately, the murders remained unsolved, so no one in her community was surprised when she took the life of her brother's murderer, who had thought he would get away with it just like the previous perpetrators did. Number 8. A man who more than 200 women lynched. This guy wasn't just a murderer. You could say he could have created a whole portfolio of crimes under his belt if he wanted to. The man in question is Bharat Kalicharan, known by the name Aku Yadav. Every criminal activity you could name, he was involved in. From robbery, home invasion, kidnapping, and extortion to serious crimes like multiple SAs and murders in the Kasturba Nagar slum in Nagpur, India. He became famous during the late 1990s and early 2000s for terrorizing the slums of Nagpur. He led a gang of henchmen using brute force and intimidation to instill fear and maintain control. However, Yadav's most notorious deeds centered around sexual assault, targeting numerous women in the slums. He subjected these women to SA and abuse for over a decade, reportedly assaulting over 40 victims, and that included a 10-year-old girl. He was arrested a total of 14 times, but managed to evade conviction each time. His victims lived in constant fear because local police ignored his crimes, influenced by Yadav's bribes. But in 2004, things took a turn for good. During a trial at the Nagpur Sessions Court, where Aku Yadav was facing R***E charges, a group of more than 200 women who had been victimized by him decided to take justice into their own hands. On August 13, 2004, as Yadav appeared in court for a bail hearing, he spotted one of his previous victims and insulted her, even as police officers looked on. Having had enough, a woman in the courtroom struck Yadav with her slipper, which ignited a collective response from other women present. Within moments, a crowd of 200 women descended upon Yadav. All of them had gathered after hearing rumors of him being set free. They stormed the courtroom, overpowering guards and court officials. They threw chili powder in Yadav's face and used a kitchen knife to dismember him. He was then stabbed at least 70 times by the women. Despite pleas for mercy, Yadav met his end in just 15 minutes. Post-mortem reports revealed he had sustained 74 stab wounds. The women claimed their actions were acts of self-defense, marking the end of Yadav's decade-long reign of terror in Nagpur. Initially, 5 were arrested, but they were later released after a citywide protest. Every woman in the slum claimed responsibility for the murder, stating that no single person should shoulder the blame. They urged the police to arrest them all. No one was charged. After all, what alternative did the women have? Number 9. A man who aimed a gun at the cops. On the evening of July 26, 2023, at around 10 p.m., 28-year-old Macy Juka dialed 911 for help. He seemed to be speaking gibberish and acting strangely, suggesting he might be mentally ill or under the influence of something. Before hanging up, he mentioned having an assault rifle at home. Responding to the call, Officer Lee parked his vehicle about half a mile away from Juka's residence and called him back. Juka confessed to the officer that he had been drinking, purchased heroin, and was feeling suicidal.
Did he shooting?
Shortly after, the sound of gunshots echoed through the area as Juka began firing an assault rifle. Officers on the scene promptly instructed Juka to drop the weapon and raise his hands in the air.
Keep your hands above your head!
Clear the air. We got one with a long gun.
Clear out that. Return early.
Stop where you're at!
Initially, he complied, placing the firearm on a nearby car. He then moved a short distance away, knelt down, and remained on the ground. When everything looked almost under control, Juka got up and ran.
Hey, stop!
He picked up the rifle and pointed it toward the officers. In response, 6 officers returned fire. Despite being struck and falling to the ground, Juka kept his weapon raised and continued to shoot at the officers. Once Juka was down and the rifle was still in his hands, officers came up with a plan to approach him safely. They managed to get hold of the rifle and started giving him medical help until paramedics showed up. Sadly, Juka didn't make it and passed away at the scene. The officers' actions were considered reasonable, and I'm just glad they all made it out okay.
It is a case that shocked the Spring community. One of their own accused of hatching a plot to have her husband killed.
Marriages falling apart is tough enough, but divorces taking a dark turn into murder for hire plots? It's just crazy how often that happens. Originally from Houston, Texas, Ramon met Lulu in 2007 and quickly got married. They even went into business together, opening up a gym and boxing ring. But things took a dark turn when Lulu secretly tried to hire a man named Gustavo to have her husband killed. What she didn't realize was that Gustavo was actually friends with Ramon. Thankfully, Gustavo did the right thing and told Ramon about Lulu's plan. Together, they came up with a plan to catch her in the act. Gustavo wore a wire during his next meeting with Lulu, recording everything she said. They then handed the evidence over to the Houston police. However, just the tape wasn't enough to convict Lulu. So, with the help of the FBI and Texas Rangers, they came up with a plan for Ramon to fake his own death and take photos of it. Undercover police officers applied makeup to Ramon's head to make it look like he had been shot. Later, an undercover officer posing as a hitman met Lulu in a parking lot and showed her the fake photos of her supposedly dead husband. This led to Lulu's arrest, and she eventually pleaded guilty to solicitation of murder. She was sentenced to 20 years behind bars in October 2016. Number 12. Father took justice into his own hands. It was July 2000 when 25-year-old Paula Gallo became the victim of a local gang. She was kidnapped from her family's vacation home in Tepoztlan, Mexico. It was apparently all an extortion attempt, as the gang demanded a ransom from the family if they wanted Paula back. The father, Eduardo Gallo, desperate to save his daughter, paid the gang more than $18,000. But it was all in vain, as the officers found his daughter's body lifeless. 3 suspects were taken into custody, but the man who had pulled the trigger was still free. But the investigators gave up quite soon. That's when the vengeful father decided to take action himself. He had to close his consulting business and play detective. Anything for his daughter that was taken so soon. It took more than a year, but it was quite worth it. Gallo had found the perpetrator. The man was determined. Guess how he found the suspect? By tracking the payphone he used. When you gotta do something, you gotta do it. And instead of putting his own life in danger, he decided to lead the authorities to the suspect. It didn't take long for the authorities to set a trap and arrest the suspect, who turned out to be 28-year-old Francisco Zamora Arellano. He confessed to the murder soon enough. Number 13. Dad fights for 3 decades to take down his daughter's killer. This case goes all the way back to 1982. Kalinka Bambursky was just 14 when she became the victim of assault, and the perpetrator took her life soon after. Her body was discovered at the lakeside home of a German doctor named Dieter Krombach, who was her stepfather. She clearly had bodily trauma, a mark of injection on her arm. That's more than enough to show that there was some foul play. Despite Andrei Bambursky's suspicions and pleas, the German authorities refused to investigate the case. For 30 long years, Dieter Krombach remained a free man. For 30 long years, Krombach walked free while Andrei, a retired accountant, dedicated everything he had to make sure that the man he believed to be a monster was caught. Despite making numerous trips to Germany over the years, Andrei found that Krombach kept disappearing from sight. Finally, Andrei had had enough. He decided to hire several men, spending nearly $30,000 to forcibly bring Krombach to France. In October 2009, the hired men grabbed Krombach and left him battered and confused outside a courthouse in Mulhouse, France. After decades of waiting, Krombach finally faced trial for Kalinka Bambursky's death. The court in Paris found him guilty and sentenced him to 15 years behind bars. It's ironic how justice seemed to have been asleep when it came to investigating a teenage girl's death, but suddenly woke up when it was least expected. In 2014, a court in Mulhouse gave Bambursky a suspended one-year sentence for his role in Krombach's apprehension. Number 14. The woman who dismembered her husband.
Testimony begins in a court case that has attracted international attention.
Then, up next, is the story of Lorena Bobbitt, who had been a victim of marital SA by her own husband, John Wayne Bobbitt. In 1993, she had enough after her husband once again SA'd her. While he was sleeping, she decided to retaliate and cut off his reproductive organ with a kitchen, after which she drove away and threw it into a field. It was quickly discovered and taken to the hospital. There, Doctors Sane and Berman did a 9-hour surgical marathon to reattach it to the man. Lorena was charged with malicious wounding charges in 1994. Number 15. A Chinese 5-man deep chain of bumbling subcontractors. Now let's go all the way back to 2013 in China, where a real estate tycoon named Tan Yuhui had a big problem, and that problem was another developer. Like any mature businessman, he decided to hire a hitman to take him out. It all started when Tan decided to hire a hitman to take out a rival developer who had sued his company over a building dispute. Tan shelled out a whopping $282,800 to a guy named Shi Guangan for the job. But instead of doing the deed himself, Shi decided to pass the buck and hired another hitman, Mo Qianxiang, with half the cash. But Mo wasn't up to the task either. He passed it on to yet another guy named Yang Kangsheng, paying him $38,000 up front and promising more once the job was done. But the subcontracting didn't stop there. Yang Kangsheng then handed off the job to a fourth man, Yang Guangsheng, for $28,000 up front and a promise of $71,000 upon completion. And guess what? The pattern continued when the second Yang passed it to a fifth man, Ling Xianxi, for a measly $14,000. Ling ended up spilling the beans on the whole plot to the developer. Together, they staged a fake murder scene, complete with the developer tied up in an attempt to collect the cash. But the jig was up when the developer went to the police and spilled the beans. Each of the would-be hitmen got slapped with sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years in prison. And as for Tan, well, he got the longest sentence of them all. 5 years behind bars. That's about all. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons.